How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Shandor in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Paul in Chicago, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Jonathan says wishing everyone Shavua Tov, Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck, Frank in San Pedro, Jonathan in Thousand Oaks, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella's in the house, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Spencer in West Hartford, reminding us all, Am Yisrael Chai, bring them home now. Amen. Aoife in Florida, Bill in Fort Worth. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 86 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. It's settled there. Okay. Let's get to it. I find some personal relevance in today's daf, as evidenced by the title that I chose. We'll get to it momentarily. Okay, we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in Perek HaChovel, chapter 8 in Tractate Bava Kamma. And the sages have already established that when the Torah says an eye for an eye, it means that the one who causes someone else to lose an eye or a tooth or a hand or other extremity has to compensate them with money accordingly. And we've seen that there's 5 kinds of payment that are made. The actual damage, right, which takes into account, let's say, the loss of an extremity and what that will mean in terms of future earnings, as well as loss of livelihood during the period of recovery, medical costs, pain and suffering, and humiliation. Okay, Rabbah, so we picked this up at the bottom of 85b. Rabbah raises a dilemma. If one injured another, causing him loss of livelihood that diminishes his monetary value, what is the halacha? What is the law? And the Gemara explains what are the circumstances of this case. For example, in a case where he struck him on his hand, and his hand became weakened so that he could not work, but his hand will ultimately return to its original health. Then what is the law? Say you broke somebody's hand, okay? So he doesn't have the use of his hand for as many weeks or months as it takes to heal, but then it will come back. Since his hand will ultimately return to its original health, he does not need to give him any compensation whatsoever for damage. Or perhaps, in any event, he has diminished his value for now. So come in here a resolution to this dilemma from a Mishna that we'll find on page 87a. One who strikes his father or his mother and did not cause them to have a bruise, and who therefore is not liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment, which is the punishment for hitting your parents, right? If you hit your parents, it not only violates, give honor to your parents, honor your parents, but it so much goes in the other direction, dishonoring your parents by actually striking them, that is liable to receive capital punishment. But it would require the kind of blow that leaves a bruise. So without the bruise, you don't have the penalty for one who causes his parents a bruise. And, right, so coming here a resolution to this dilemma from a Mishna on page 87a, that one who strikes his father or his mother and did not cause them to have a bruise, so it doesn't trigger capital punishment, and one who injures another on Yom Kippur, and therefore is liable to kares, right, excision from the world to come, meaning you lose your portion in the world to come, and therefore is not liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment. In both of these cases, the person is liable to pay all the 5 types of indemnity. Right? If you actually triggered court-imposed capital punishment, then you wouldn't have to pay damages because you'd be subject to the much heavier penalty, i.e. the death penalty. But the death penalty doesn't apply when you hit your parents and you don't leave a bruise, or or if you struck somebody on Yom Kippur, where it's not court-imposed capital punishment, but rather charis. So in these cases, the financial penalty can apply, and it does. So the Gemara explains, in this case, and now we're on 86a, in this case of one who injured his parent but did not bruise him, what are the circumstances? Is it not a case where he struck him on his hand, and it will eventually return to its original health? And with regard to this case, that with regard to this case, that Mishna teaches he is liable to pay all of the 5 types of indemnity. So if so, this resolves Rabba's dilemma, right? The fact that you injured somebody in a manner that is not permanent, nevertheless, it was a serious injury, and so you are liable to pay the 5 types of indemnity. But the sages object, not necessarily to the outcome, but to using that source as a proof. The sages object and say, here we are dealing with a case where he deafened his parent by striking him, but did not bruise him. Since his father's hearing loss is permanent, he is liable to pay all 5 types of indemnity, and this is not relevant to Rabba's dilemma. And the Gemara objects, but doesn't Rabba himself say that one who deafens his father is executed? Even though no bruise is visible, he's liable to capital punishment because it is impossible for deafening to occur without a bruise. Maybe we don't see a visible bruise, but if you cause a person to become deaf, that's a very extreme injury that you have caused. And there's a bruise somewhere, even if we don't see it. And if you do that to your parent, you're liable to court-imposed capital punishment. Says the Gemara, it is certain that a drop of blood fell into his ear from the blow, even if it is not visible from the outside. So rather, it must be that here we are dealing with a case where he shaved his father's hair without causing a bruise. So in a case where he shaved him, his hair will return, and this is an example of our dilemma, i.e. an injury to a limb that will return to its original health. So if so, this resolves Rabba's dilemma. And the sages again object, and they say it is possible that here we are dealing with a case where he smeared his father with a depilatory agent known as nasha that caused his hair to fall out so that his hair will not return. It's a permanent injury, so we haven't established a clear case where we have a precedent that shows that you do pay the 5 types of indemnity even though the injury is not permanent. Because that case of causing his father to lose his hair might be a permanent injury. So we don't have an example of a temporary injury, right? One that will heal, where the defendant was forced to pay the 5 types of indemnity. And the Gemara explains how one could be liable for each of the 5 types of indemnity in the case of smearing a depilatory agent, right? That causes hair to fall out permanently. So why would there be 5 types of indemnity? Well, the father experiences a pain in a case where he has fissures on his head and has pain from the agent getting into those fissures, or that the agent caused the fissures. And he incurs medical costs because he requires healing for the fissures, F-I-S-S-U-R-E-S, fissures. And he incurs loss of livelihood in a case where his father would dance in taverns to earn money, which requires him to make various gestures with his head and his hair while dancing. And now he cannot gesture because of those fissures on his head. And he experiences humiliation. Why? Says the Gemara, there is no humiliation greater than losing one's hair. I would disagree. I don't feel humiliated that I've lost my hair. But I think what they're talking about is not just the natural loss of hair, which is not humiliating, but, somebody who had hair, and somebody else, scalped him. Right? Somebody else shaved him publicly. Somebody else removed his hair for the purpose of humiliating him. Then that certainly is quite humiliating. And as we'll see later in today's daf, one of the aspects of humiliation, which triggers the payment of damages for humiliation, is that the person who created the humiliation intended to humiliate, right? So if you intend to humiliate by shaving someone publicly, removing their hair publicly, then yeah, that is very humiliating and certainly triggers the payment. Now the Gemara comments, and the matter that is a dilemma for Rabbah is obvious to Abaye on this side of the dilemma and to Rava on that side of the dilemma, meaning they each resolve the dilemma but with opposing conclusions. As it was stated, if one struck another on his hand and the hand was weakened, but it will ultimately return to its original health, right? You broke someone's hand, it will heal, but it's very bad for them while it's, broken. So Abaye says he gives him compensation for his major loss of livelihood, i.e. the decrease in his value due to his temporary loss of the hand, as measured by his price on the slave market, what he would fetch minus a hand, and his minor loss of livelihood, i.e. the money that he would have earned while idle during his recovery. And Rava says he gives him only the value of his loss of livelihood for each and every day, and he does not give him the full value of his hand, since ultimately the hand will come back to use. New subject. The Gemara presents another dispute between Abaye and Rava. So as stated, with regard to one who severs the hand of a Hebrew slave who belongs to another, Abaye says he gives compensation for the major loss of livelihood to the slave, and compensation for the minor loss of livelihood to the master, right? The major loss of livelihood, meaning you've lost a hand, you can never do what your profession would have required you to do, for which you needed that hand. And minor loss of livelihood, meaning just the loss of wages during the period of the recovery. And so the major loss of livelihood would be paid to the slave, and the minor loss of livelihood to the master. Rava says all the compensation shall be given to the slave, and land shall be purchased with the money, and the master garners the profits from the land for the duration of the slave's term of slavery. Recall that when we're talking about a Hebrew slave, in ancient times, you had this practice that a Jew could become enslaved to another Jew. Why? Because he got himself in trouble, couldn't pay his debts, found that he had no way out, or he got caught stealing, and his sentence was to be enslaved to another Jew, but it's temporary, right? It's going to last 6 years, and then he goes out free, and when he goes out, he shall not go out empty-handed. He has to have like a little bit of a nest egg with which to get his life restarted. But during that period of really indentured servitude, let's say, his labor belongs to the master. So it makes sense that the minor loss of livelihood would accrue to the master, and the major loss, any permanent damage, would accrue to the slave, who will not be a slave at the end of that period. Now the Gemara comments, it is obvious that if one injured a slave and thereby reduced the slave's value for the slave himself, but he did not reduce the slave's value for his master, that this would make sense. And the Gemara immediately interjects, well, what are the circumstances where this is possible, where his own value is reduced, but not his value to his master? And answers the Gemara, this is possible in a case where the injury that the slave sustained was to the tip of his ear or the tip of his nostril, which does not impact the slave's ability to perform labor for his master, but might, deface him, disfigure him permanently, which is something that would stay with him even after he became a free man at the end of his servitude. So the Gemara returns to continue the statement. So in such a case, all of the compensation goes to the slave himself. So if the injury reduced the slave's value for his master, then this is the case of the dispute of Abaye and Rava, whether that minor loss of livelihood goes to the slave or the master. New subject, the Mishna teaches how is payment for humiliation assessed? Okay, we get that somebody's entitled to damages for humiliation. How do we measure it? It all depends on the stature of the one who humiliates the other and the one who is humiliated. And the Gemara asks, whose opinion is expressed in the Mishnah? It is not the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and it is not the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, it seems to be the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And these opinions are, as we learned, in a baraisa. And in all of those cases of Jews who were humiliated, regardless of their individual stature, they are viewed as though they were free men who lost their property and were impoverished, and their humiliation is calculated according to this status, as they are all the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and are all of prominent lineage, right? All Jews vis-a-vis each other are considered prominent people, and you're not going to distinguish between, no, this guy's a famous, prominent person in his community, and this guy's kind of a schnook, and therefore if the schnook is humiliated publicly, he's somehow entitled to less money than if this prominent, leader of the community is humiliated, that his humiliation is greater. Says Rabbi Meir, no, they're all viewed the same. They're all viewed as prominent people who have become poor, and so a poor man's humiliation is somehow deemed to be less damage-inducing than a rich person's humiliation, which is a leniency for the one who causes the humiliation, so that, if you're going to say that rich people, their humiliation is greater, then, if a poor person happens to humiliate a rich person, he'll never escape, debt for trying to pay off those damages. So says Rabbi Meir, we view everybody as if they were poor. Everyone's worth and everyone's, reckoning of what the humiliation is worth is going to be the same. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says, the court views each person according to his stature, the great person according to his greatness, and the small person according to his smallness. So Rabbi Shimon says, in a case of wealthy people, the court views them as though they were free men who lost their property. In a case of poor people, the court views them as the least among the poor. And this lessens the payment of compensation for the one who caused humiliation. And the Gemara explains whose opinion is expressed in our Mishnah. Now, if it is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, well, the Mishnah teaches it all depends on the stature of the one who humiliates the other and the one who is humiliated. And Rabbi Meir holds in the Baraisa that all of those who were humiliated are considered alike to one another. So it can't be Rabbi Meir's opinion. And if it is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, well, a Mishnah teaches on page 86b, our next Mishnah we'll come to today, that one who humiliates a blind person is liable, whereas Rabbi Yehuda says in a Baraisa that a blind person does not have humiliation. That actually doesn't mean what it seems to mean. We'll get to that a little later. Rather, is the opinion expressed in the Mishnah not that of Rabbi Shimon. But the Gemara rejects this conclusion. You can even say that the Mishnah expresses the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And when Rabbi Yehuda said that a blind person does not have humiliation, he meant with regard to another taking compensation for humiliation from him, meaning that a blind person is not liable to pay damages for humiliating another person. Why? Because a blind person is not fully aware of what he's doing, and one can be rendered liable for causing humiliation only if he intended to humiliate the other person. But with regard to giving him compensation for becoming humiliated, of course the blind man is entitled to compensation if somebody humiliates him, right? But because he can't know exactly what he's doing, we're lenient and say that blind people are not subject to pay damages for humiliating others. Now the Gemara challenges this explanation of the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. But from the fact that the latter clause of that Mishnah teaches that one who humiliates a sleeping person is liable, but a sleeping person who humiliates someone else, he is exempt, right? He had no control over his actions while he was asleep. So if he caused humiliation to someone else through some action he did while sleepwalking, he's exempt from liability because he clearly did not intend to humiliate that other person. On the other hand, if we say that it is possible to humiliate a sleeping person, what does that mean? It means that the person who is humiliated doesn't even need to be aware that he's been humiliated and can still be, qualified to receive damages. Right? From the fact that the latter clause of that Mishnah teaches that one who humiliates a sleeping person is liable, but a sleeping person who humiliates another is exempt, and does not teach that a blind person who humiliates another is exempt. So by inference, the Mishnah teaches that there is no difference this way and there is no difference that way. Whether a blind person humiliates another or is humiliated, the one who causes humiliation is liable to pay. So rather, it is clear that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. New subject. The Gemara analyzes a related baraisa in light of the three opinions that were just cited. Who is the Tana that taught this baraisa? As the sages taught, if one intended to humiliate a katan, right, which is translated here as a small man, but can also be translated as a minor. And instead, so he intended to humiliate a katan, right, either a small man or a minor, and he instead humiliated a gadol, which either means a great man or an adult. So in this case, he gives the money that he would have owed for the small man's humiliation to the great man. And if one intended to humiliate a slave, and he instead humiliated a free man, so he gives the money that he would have owed for the slave's humiliation to the free man, right? In both cases, he intended to cause humiliation, but the humiliation landed on the wrong person, as it were. So he's only liable to the amount, which is the smaller amount, because he intended to humiliate a small person. He ended up humiliating a big person, but he only owes the damages that he would have had to pay if he humiliated the small person. It doesn't even say what the reverse, right? So if he intended to humiliate a big person and ended up humiliating a small person, does he give the damages that he would have owed to the big man now to the small man? The Gemara doesn't say that. Rather, it just says that even though the humiliation he intended to cause landed on the wrong person, he is still liable, but only in that smaller amount. And whose opinion is this? It is not the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and not the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and not the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, right? Because Rabbi Meir says everyone is the same. Rabbi Yehuda, right, how does it apply? Rabbi Yehuda says we view each person according to their stature. So why would he give a different amount than the one he ended up humiliating? And Rabbi Shimon is the one who said, that in the case of wealthy people, the court views them as though they were freemen who lost all their property. In the case of poor people, we view them as the least among the poor. So that doesn't line up with this baraisa that we just learned, right? So it's not in accordance with Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara explains why this is not in accordance with the opinion of each of these men. And if it enters your mind to say that when the baraisa is referring to a katan, it means that he is small in terms of his property, meaning that he is poor. And when the baraisa is referring to a gadol, it means that he is great in terms of his property, i.e. that he is wealthy. If this baraisa is stating the opinion of Rabbi Meir, doesn't he say in the baraisa that all of those who are humiliated are considered the same as one another? And if it is stating the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, doesn't he say slaves have no humiliation? Whereas the baraisa discusses the compensation owed to a slave. And if it is stating the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, doesn't he say if one intended to humiliate this one and instead humiliated that one, he is exempt? Doesn't matter whether the one you ended up humiliating is greater or lesser than the one you intended to humiliate. The fact is you're exempt from paying any damages unless you humiliated the person that you intended to humiliate, because humiliation requires specific intent in order to be liable. Now the Gemara explains Rabbi Shimon's statement. What is the reason for exempting one who humiliated a person whom he did not intend to humiliate? Well, the law of humiliation is like the law of killing. And just as in a case of killing, the murderer is not executed unless he intended to kill the victim specifically. As it is written, Deuteronomy 19:11, and he lies in wait for him and rises up against him, which means he's not liable unless he intended to kill him specifically. And so too in a case of humiliation, the one who humiliated is not liable unless he intended to humiliate him specifically, as it is written, and she put forth her hand and took him by his genitals. Deuteronomy 25:11, and this teaches that one is not liable for causing humiliation unless he intended to humiliate that person specifically. So the Gemara returns to analyzing the Baraisa. Actually, the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And when Rabbi Yehuda said that slaves have no humiliation, he meant that one would not be liable to give them compensation for humiliation, right? Because they're already in this lowly state. But if the court needs to appraise compensation for the humiliation of others according to their humiliation, and thereby determine the compensation that one owes to a free man when he intended to humiliate a slave, then we do appraise according to their humiliation. You don't owe damages for humiliating a slave, but we still may need to measure what that amount would be. Now the Gemara presents an alternative explanation of the Baraisa. And if you wish, say instead, you can even say that the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Do you maintain that when the Baraisa is referring to a gadol, it means he is great in terms of his property? And when the Baraisa is referring to a katan, it means he is small in terms of his property? No, rather, when the Baraisa is referring to a gadol, it means an adult. And when the Baraisa is referring to a katan, it means a minor. And so the Gemara asks, but is a minor subject to humiliation? And the Gemara answers, yes. As Rav Papa said with regard to another law, the case involves a minor who has reached a stage in which when others humiliate him, he feels humiliation. Here too, we say that the Baraisa discusses a case involving a minor who has reached a stage of development that when others humiliate him, he feels humiliation. So if he's aware that he was humiliated, if it's possible for him to understand that, if he's old enough for that, then he can be owed damages for humiliation. Now we're on 86b, and that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 8. Moving on to Mishnah number 2. One who humiliates a naked person, or one who humiliates a blind person, or one who humiliates a sleeping person is liable. But a sleeping person who humiliates another is exempt, right? The sleeping person had no intention. If one fell from the roof onto another person and thereby caused him damage and humiliated him, then the one who fell is liable for the indemnity of damage, since a person is always considered forewarned, but he's exempt from the indemnity of humiliation, since a person is not liable for humiliation unless he intends to humiliate the other person. Interesting that if you fell off a roof, you are going to be liable for the damage. As we've seen, you're liable when you cause damage to another person, even if you did it unintentionally. But humiliation requires intention. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The sages taught in a Baraisa, Tosefta 9:12, that if one humiliated another who was naked, he is liable. But the magnitude of humiliation felt when he humiliated him while naked is not comparable to the magnitude of humiliation felt had he humiliated him while clothed, since one who chooses to be naked is less sensitive to humiliation. Somebody who walks around without clothes in public, he apparently is not so subject to humiliation. So there is humiliation for a naked person, but we're going to assess it at a lower rate than one who humiliates a person who doesn't walk around naked. And similarly, if one humiliated another person in a bathhouse, he is liable. But the magnitude of humiliation felt when he humiliated him in a bathhouse is not comparable to the magnitude of humiliation felt had he humiliated him in the marketplace. And the Gemara clarifies the Baraisa. The master says, if one humiliated another who was naked, the one who humiliated him is liable. And the Gemara asks, is a naked person subject to humiliation? Is it possible to humiliate him in this state? And Rav Papa said, what does the Baraisa mean when it says naked? It means a case where a gust of wind came and lifted his clothes, and then this other one came and raised them higher and humiliated him. And the Baraisa also teaches if one humiliated another in a bathhouse, he is liable. And the Gemara asks, is one in a bathhouse subject to humiliation? In a place where people stand around naked, can a person be humiliated by having his clothes removed? And Rav Papa said this is a case where he humiliated him not in an actual bathhouse, but on the bank of the river, which is a place where people behave more discreetly when they undress. Now, is this to say that the only way to humiliate another person is to strip his clothes off him? And that's why we're talking about cases where somebody's already naked? No. Taking somebody's clothes from him in a public way is very humiliating and certainly will trigger payment for damage, but is not the only way that other people can be humiliated. And so, for example, if a person was standing around naked in a bathhouse and you spit on him or shaved his head or something like that, I don't know if that amount of damages would be reduced just because the person was naked. It's just that if you happen to use the method of humiliation where you remove someone's clothes and they were already, standing around with most of their clothes removed, then the amount of damages might be lessened. New subject. Rabbi Abba Bar Memel raises a dilemma. If one humiliated another who was asleep and he died before he awoke, so he never knew of his humiliation, what is the law? And the Gemara asks, what is his dilemma? Rav Zeved said that this is his dilemma. Is the compensation for humiliation due to embarrassment, i.e. that his feelings suffer because of what he experienced? And this one died and does not have that feeling of embarrassment. He never knew that somebody humiliated him. Or perhaps the compensation for humiliation is due to disgrace, i.e. a lessening of his honor in front of other people. And in this case, somebody disgraced him, even though he was asleep and he never woke up from that sleep. Others were aware that he had been humiliated, right? I mean, wasn't there a case not long ago of a politician that, took a picture of him doing something gross, around another person that was sleeping, right? So the sleeping person was not aware that they had been humiliated in this way. And maybe was never aware. Maybe the picture never, was circulated in such a way that the sleeping person became aware of it. But other people were aware of it. And so the honor, so to speak, of the sleeping person was diminished. So what does humiliation, damages paid for humiliation, what does it compensate for? Your own feelings of embarrassment that somebody humiliated you, or the fact that your honor was lessened in the eyes of others? So the Gemara suggests, come in here, a resolution to the dilemma from a baraisa. Rabbi Meir says, a deaf mute and a minor have the right to receive compensation for humiliation. An imbecile does not have the right to receive compensation for humiliation. The Gemara explains, granted, if you say that the compensation is due to disgrace, right, meaning a lessening of the honor, even if the person wasn't aware of it, well, then this explanation is consistent with that which the Baraisa teaches concerning a minor who can be disgraced. But if you say that the compensation is due to embarrassment, is a minor subject to humiliation? And the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Rather, what do you mean by stating that the compensation is due to disgrace? If compensation is granted due to disgrace, then an imbecile should receive compensation as well. The fact that he doesn't understand that other people have mocked him doesn't mean that they haven't mocked him. So if the damages are paid because of disgrace rather than the painful feelings of embarrassment, then an imbecile should qualify to receive damages like the same way. And the sages say in response, with regard to an imbecile, you can have no greater humiliation than this. It is impossible to degrade him further. And the Gemara returns to the original suggestion. So in any case, resolve from this baraisa that the compensation is due to disgrace, as if it is due to embarrassment, is a minor subject to embarrassment? And the Gemara rejects this proof. This is, as Rav Papa said, with regard to a different law that was cited later by the Gemara. The case involves a minor who has reached an age in which when others humiliate him, he feels humiliation. Here too, say that this baraisa discusses a case involving a minor who has reached an age in which when others humiliate him, he feels the humiliation. And this is how Rav Zeved understands the dilemma of Rabbi Abba bar Memel. So have we answered whether humiliation damages are paid because of disgrace, lowering their honor, or because of embarrassment? It seems like we haven't answered that yet. So Rav Papa explains Rabbi Abba bar Memel's dilemma differently. Rav Papa said that this is his dilemma. Is the compensation for humiliation due to his own embarrassment, and the one who was sleeping and then died was never embarrassed? Or perhaps the compensation for humiliation is due to his family's humiliation, and therefore the one who humiliated him must pay compensation to his family. And the Gemara suggests, come in here, resolution from the same Baraisa. A deaf mute and a minor have the right to receive compensation for humiliation. An imbecile does not have the right to receive compensation for humiliation. The Gemara explains, granted, if you say that the compensation is due to the family's humiliation, well, this explanation is consistent with that which the Baraisa teaches concerning a minor whose family can experience humiliation based on what was done to their relative. But if you say that the compensation is due to his own embarrassment, is a minor subject to humiliation? And the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Rather, what do you mean by stating that the compensation is due to the humiliation of members of his family? If this is the case, an imbecile also should receive compensation. And the sages say in response, if one is an imbecile, there is no greater humiliation than that. You can't degrade him further. So the Gemara returns to the original suggestion. In any case, resolve from this that the compensation is due to his family's humiliation, as if it is due to embarrassment, is a minor subject to embarrassment? And again, Rav Papa said, yes, a minor who's old enough to be embarrassed when people humiliate him, he feels embarrassment, he feels humiliation. So he would be entitled, even though he's a minor. And the Gemara adds, and this distinction is taught in a Baraisa as Rebbe, right? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, known as Rebbe, says, a deaf mute has the right to receive compensation for humiliation. An imbecile does not have the right to receive compensation for humiliation. And with regard to a minor, sometimes he has the right to receive compensation for humiliation, and sometimes he does not have the right. Why is this so? This case where he has the right to receive compensation for humiliation is one involving a minor who has reached the stage of development in which, when others humiliate him, he feels humiliation. And that case where the minor does not have the right to receive compensation for humiliation is one involving a minor who has not reached the stage in which, when others humiliate him, he feels humiliation. Now the Mishna teaches, one who humiliates a blind person is liable to pay compensation. And the Gemara comments that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as it is taught in the Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person who humiliated someone else does not have liability for humiliation. Right? A blind person who humiliates another, the blind person is not liable to pay damages for that. And in this way, Rabbi Yehuda deemed a blind person exempt from being among those liable to be exiled for killing unintentionally, right? That's the law of the manslaughterer. And from being among those liable to receive lashes, and from being among those liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment if he transgresses a prohibition for which the Torah mandates one of these punishments. And what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? He derives a verbal analogy to Deuteronomy 25:12, your eye shall not pity. And this was stated with regard to humiliation from your eye shall not pity, which was stated with regard to conspiring witnesses, right? So the witnesses who lie and based on their testimony might cause a defendant, to suffer some grievous punishment. When it's proven that these witnesses conspired to lie and to give false testimony, then they are going to be subject to whatever liability and whatever punishment the defendant would have been subject to based on their testimony. And about the conspiring witnesses, the Torah says, your eye shall not pity, because what they did was vile and evil. So the analogy teaches that just as there, with regard to the law of conspiring witnesses, blind people are not included, as blind people cannot see events occur in order to testify, right? So they can't become conspiring witnesses because they can't be witnesses. So too here, with regard to the law of compensation for humiliation, blind people are also not included. And the Gemara continues its explanation. Why did Rabbi Yehuda deem a blind person exempt from being among those liable to be exiled for killing unintentionally? A blind person can commit murder or manslaughter. So why wouldn't they be subject to the law of the manslaughter, right? Which recall that if somebody killed, in a heat of passion, but not lying in wait, premeditated murder, or it was sometimes through negligence. So then, in ancient Israel, there were the cities of refuge where the manslaughterer could flee and he would be protected from the avenger of blood, right? So there would be like a blood feud between families when there was a murder. But if he was a manslaughterer, he would be exempt from, being caught and killed by the avenger of blood, so long as he stayed within his place of exile, the city of refuge, for how long? Until the current high priest dies, right? So it could be, 1 year, could be 50 years that he's going to have to stay in the city of refuge. So, don't commit manslaughter. But at any rate, so the law of the manslaughter, Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person is not subject to that law. Why? As it is taught in a Baraisa that the verse states, with regard to an unintentional killing, or with any stone whereby one may die, seeing him not. This is Numbers 35:23. And this formulation of the law in that verse in the Torah serves to exclude a blind person. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says the verse serves to include a blind person. And the Gemara explains the dispute. What is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? He would say to you that the verse states with regard to an unintentional killing, without any further limiting clause, as when one goes into the forest with his neighbor to chop wood, and this includes even a blind person, and therefore the merciful one wrote in the Torah, seeing him not, to exclude a blind person, right? This is what the case in the Torah is, that they were chopping wood, and one of them had an axe that had a loose top, and the axe head, the metal part, went flying off and killed his friend, right? So maybe he was negligent to work with such an axe, but he certainly didn't mean to kill his friend. This is the prototypical case of the manslaughter who will flee to the city of refuge, right? But it says, seeing him not. He didn't know that the other guy was standing behind him when he took the backswing, that either the axe head flew off or just simply in the backswing of his axe, it killed the guy that was standing behind him. Why? Because he didn't see him, right? So that would seem to indicate that he had to have the ability to see. He just didn't see him. And that's why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this law excludes a blind person who wouldn't even be guilty, I guess, of the manslaughter charge. And what is the reasoning of Rabbi Meir? The merciful one wrote in the Torah, seeing him not, apparently to exclude one who happened to not see the one that he killed. And the merciful one wrote in the Torah, who kills his neighbor unawares, at Deuteronomy 19:4, apparently to exclude a blind person who is not aware of where others are standing. And this is a restriction following a restriction, and there is an hermeneutical principle that a restriction following a restriction serves only to amplify the law and include additional cases, and therefore a blind person is included in the law of those liable to be exiled for unintentional killing, right? So Rabbi Meir would treat the blind person like anyone else with regard to the law of the manslaughter, whereas Rabbi Yehuda would exclude him. And so the Gemara asks, and what would Rabbi Yehuda respond to this reasoning? And the Gemara explains that verse, who kills his neighbor unawares, does not exclude one who could not see, but rather it comes to exclude one who was intending to kill a particular person and unintentionally killed someone else. That killer is not exiled. That's going to be a different consequences for him. Now the Gemara continues to explain the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Why did he deem a blind person exempt from being among those liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment? That law is derived by means of a verbal analogy to Numbers 36:15. But if he smote him with an instrument of iron so that he died, he is a killer. The killer shall be put to death, which is written with regard to capital punishment. And we're going to distinguish that from Numbers 35:11. You shall appoint for yourselves cities to be cities of refuge for you, that a killer who killed any person unintentionally may flee there. The law of the manslaughterer. And this is written with regard to those liable to be exiled. So why did Rabbi Yehuda deem a blind person exempt from being among those liable to receive lashes? That law is derived by means of a verbal analogy to, then it shall be if the guilty one deserves to be beaten. Written with regard to lashes, from, moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer that is guilty of death. Written with regard to those liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment. Right? So once Rabbi Yehuda excludes in one category, he can extend that exclusion to others. And the Gemara presents another statement of Rabbi Yehuda. It is taught in another baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person does not have humiliation. And so did Rabbi Yehuda exempt a blind person from all judgments of civil law that are in the Torah. And the Gemara explains, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? The verse states, with regard to an unintentional killing, then the congregation shall judge between the smiter and the avenger of blood according to these laws, to teach that anyone who is subject to the law of a smiter and to the law of an avenger of blood is subject to all the civil laws, and anyone who is not subject to the laws of the smiter and the law of the avenger of blood, which would include a blind person, is not subject to these other civil laws. Right? I mean, you could say that Rabbi Yehuda is somehow biased against differently abled people, and he's excluding blind people from this, large class of others who are subject to these laws. But Rabbi Yehuda does that as a leniency for blind people that, have their own challenge in life and shouldn't be subject and expected to live up to the same requirements as other people. He is the one who's making special dispensation for blind people because of their condition. Now the Gemara presents another statement of Rabbi Yehuda. And we're on 87a, and I'm almost done. So questions or comments, please get them in. So the Gemara presents another statement of Rabbi Yehuda. It is taught in other baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person does not have, i.e. receive compensation for humiliation, and so did Rabbi Yehuda exempt a blind person from all mitzvahs that are stated in the Torah. And Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Edi, said, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? The verse states, and this is the commandment, statutes, and laws, to teach that anyone who is subject to civil laws is also subject to the commandments and statutes. And anyone who is not subject to the civil laws, which according to Rabbi Yehuda includes a blind person, is also not subject to the commandments and statutes. Right? So he's not obligated in mitzvahs like other people are obligated. So Rav Yosef, who was blind, said, at first, I would say, if I hear one who says that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a blind person is exempt from the mitzvahs, then I will host a festive day for the sages. And what is the reason? It is that I am not commanded, and nevertheless I perform the mitzvahs. Right? So he's saying, if somebody could prove that Rabbi Yehuda is right, and then, I would honor them, because it means that even though I'm not obligated in the mitzvahs and I do them anyway, I'm going to get more merit, right, when I'm finally judged before the heavenly court when I leave this world. But then Rav Yosef revises his statement. He says, but now that I heard the statement of Rabbi Hanina, as Rabbi Hanina says, that one who is commanded and performs a mitzvah is greater than one who is not commanded and performs it, right? So you would think that the stuff you do voluntarily above and beyond what you're commanded is going to earn you greater merit, but that's not the way the sages of the Gemara understand mitzvahs. It is better to be obligated, and you get more credit for fulfilling the obligations that God imposed on you. So if that is the case, says Rav Yosef, now I would say that if I hear one who says to me that the law is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, Then I will host a festive day for the sages. And what is the reason? It is that I am blind, and I would rather be commanded to do all the things that I do so that I would have more reward. And with that, we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 8, and we'll pick it up tomorrow with Mishnah number 3. Let's take a couple of questions. Sharon. The Torah makes it abundantly clear that a sleeping person can be humiliated, and the offender is punished for it in the example of Noah after the flood by his son Ham. Very good, right? So Noah invented wine, right? Planted a vineyard after the flood subsided, etc. He got drunk, he lay down. And while he was asleep, his son humiliated him, and his son was punished severely for that. Very good. Lucy, it seems to me that if a poor person is humiliated, they lose all their status, whereas a rich person is not as vulnerable and will still maintain some status. So proportionately, the poor person loses more. So maybe they should receive more compensation? Do the sages ever look at the vulnerability of the injured party when they assess the damage? I mean, where they actually come out on this is much more like Rabbi Meir, that everyone is the same. But then in terms of humiliation, what they're basically being very careful in general not to multiply damages that are paid, but to lessen them, right? To lessen them. Theirs was not a very litigious society, like modern American society is. And they definitely adhered to the principle that one who seeks to extract money from another via litigation is going to really have to prove the case, right? And the law is not designed to make it easy to do that. So while we have these general principles, the sort of overriding general principle is that it's going to be not so easy to extract damages from another. Sharon, in response to Lucy, there are all sorts of examples where the diminishing of a person is greater if they had a high level of stature and were brought low. And it is specifically noted that a person should receive aid to the point of bringing him back to the position they are accustomed to. In both Eicha, Lamentations, and the Kinos of Tisha B'Av, there are multiple commentaries on the bringing low of people who had been tender, delicate, of finer stature as being especially impacted by the events of the destruction of Jerusalem, resulting in people having to beg or scrounge for their food among the filth, right? Exactly. So the daughter of this fabulously wealthy man ends up, picking barley corns out of manure to just get really to bring home the lesson of how low all the Jews were brought when the second temple was destroyed. But there's definitely is this idea that when we're giving charity, right, and by the way, let's just back up for a second. There's one thing talking about how much damages are going to be paid if somebody gets humiliated, and what is the measure of damages, and how a court is going to step in and actually make a transfer of funds. And like I said, the courts are generally not so quick to assess damages and extract damages from a defendant. But the idea of humiliating another person as a cardinal sin, that we've seen many times, right? Many times in our journey through the Talmud. And the famous saying is that it's better to jump into a fiery furnace and commit suicide than to humiliate another person publicly. So even though, damages may or may not be assessed for causing humiliation to another person, your merits on your final accounting, right, when you leave this world and stand before the heavenly tribunal and receive reward for all the good things that you did in your life and are held accountable for all the negatives, if you humiliated another person, that's a massive, massive negative within the Talmudic mind, within our understanding of what is right and wrong in the world. So thank you for that, Sharon. And then I guess Lucy responded to Sharon that yes, a privileged person can lose a great deal, but it seems to me particularly wicked to intentionally humiliate a vulnerable person like a blind, infirm, or poor person, and wondering if the sages look at that as well. And I would say that they do, right? So again, it's a different question if we're talking about, actually extracting damages, which they're gonna need sources and proofs, right? But if you're talking about, attacking a vulnerable person, I can't think of an example offhand, but I know we've had plenty. That you're expected to be a mensch, and somebody who attacks the vulnerable is vile, right? Is considered a vile person. So they definitely have that sensibility and sensitivity that you're talking about. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific.